In the New World, where the barbaric savages roamed the continent and flying arrows and swinging tomahawks were the only interaction between the Indian posses.
Well, actually, the native Indian societies were complex and well-developed systems of
A world where untamed beasts and Mother Nature ravaged the land, making farming and civilized life impossible.
In the South, almost all Indian tribes lived on the banks of the Mississippi River. This allowed them to fish, as well as grow crops without irrigation.
A group of European visionaries came searching for the immunity to practice their religions.
Dangerous ideas such as the separation of church and state and religious tolerance got Roger Williams banished from the Salem colony in 1636.
To bring peace to the relations between the savage and the civilized.
These hostile relations led to many Indian colonist conflicts, such as King Philip's War.
Introducing the Catholics, the almighty church, and who had the majority control over Europe, also known as the big bullies who caused migration to America. The Calvinists, the creators of New Age predestination and the founders of the Protestant work ethic. The Huguenots, the French baby brothers of the Calvinists. The Puritans, the English baby brothers of the Calvinists, who condemned change and sought to spread their religious influence through the New World. The Pilgrims, religious dissenters who were the first to colonize New England and, contrary to popular belief, did not wear funny hats. The Quakers, committed to religious tolerance and pacifism, and makers of damn good oatmeal. And finally, the Native Americans, the original residents of America, who were often oppressed by the new white settlers.
Oh, hello there. Before any colonization in North America, Native Americans prospered over the land. Their varied locations created a different diet, lifestyle, and social structures.
Indian tribes first came to America over the Beringia Land Bridge, a subcontinental connection between Asia and North America named after the Bering Strait. This transoceanic migration began about 30,000 years ago. Because these people were Stone Age hunters, they brought tools and animals with them and ultimately used them to settle down and begin populating North America.
Before the introduction of European culture, all Native American tribes lived sustainable ways of life. In the Southwest, the communities were based mostly on farming and were very spread out. Irrigation was a uniting factor because it was the only way to successfully grow crops in their barren environment, and it required all tribes to work together. Although they separated in order to keep out of conflict, their political system focused on coming to unanimous decisions for the sake of the survival.
Women played important social roles in Southwestern culture because they were typically the head of the household. They controlled family life, built houses, and as well as being craftswomen, hunters, and sometimes warriors, they were essential to the survival of the tribe as a whole.
Southwestern crops consisted mostly of corn, beans, squash, sunflowers, and cotton. In the South, almost all Indian tribes lived on the banks of the Mississippi River. This allowed them to fish, as well as grow crops without irrigation. Hunting was also available, giving them a well-rounded diet.
The Northeast was home to tribes with large, dense populations centered around water sources. River valleys, coasts, lakes, and harbors were the centers of the northeastern life, providing fishing, hunting, and farming. Iroquois women cultivated large harvests to support multiple longhouses, usually consisting of the most popular crops: corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers.
To avoid conflict between fellow Iroquois tribes in the Northeast, 5 chiefs created the Iroquois Confederacy. The Confederacy outlawed violence between the tribes and promoted trade and good relations. Although men were the chiefs of these gatherings and the political affairs, women had a large part in choosing the men who would represent them at the Iroquois Council.
Back across the pond in Western Europe, people lived in feudal and agricultural societies where feudal lords owned disproportional amounts of land and wealth, therefore power in their societies, and were the commanders of labor works by peasants who lived on their land. In return for the crops brought in by the peasants, the lords gave them land to live on, which made the peasants economically dependent.
Europe was extremely divided by political views, but unified under the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. The Church persecuted any non-believers and pagans, but preached the loving of God, neighbors, and the fellowship of believing in the Church.
Most people in Europe lived in extreme poverty. People survived off a little bread and porridge each day while fighting off the numerous fatal diseases. About a third of the children didn't make it past their 5th birthday, and only half made it to adulthood.
From 1347 to 1353, a bubonic plague epidemic known as the Black Death wiped out a third of the European population, creating famine and hostility in the fight for the dying economy. After the technological breakthroughs in the late Middle Ages, the 14th and 15th centuries were full of recovery in trade and commerce. This stimulated the growth of towns and markets until 1500, when Europe's full restoration was complete.
The fledgling system grew from the revival. Emerging states each brought monarchs to power who found support in wealthy merchants and traders. This union was the beginning of Europe's extraordinary naval power.
The revival also brought along the Renaissance, a return to interest in classical antiquity that came with blooming artistic and intellectual breakthroughs. It celebrated humans and their amazing capabilities, ultimately sparking the desire to explore the Americas. Christopher Columbus decided to sail through the Indies by going west across the Atlantic and found possibility in his pursuit when the monarchs of Granada agreed to finance him. In 1492, he set off with the goal of occupying and conquering any islands not already settled, and claimed them for Spain. He ended up taking 3 separate voyages, all ending up in the Caribbean and Cuban islands, especially Hispaniola. His encounters with the natives were savage and hostile. Murdering, torturing, and rape were his frequent means of interaction.
In 1517, German priest Martin Luther led the Protestant Reformation to revolt against the Roman Catholic Church and declared that eternal salvation was a gift from God, not a result of good work. His followers came from all over Europe due to the widespread dissatisfaction with the power and corruption of the Catholic Church.
Jean Ribault and 150 other Protestants left from Normandy and surprised other countries by beginning to colonize in the US and around Florida. The settling of North America brought in diseases that the Native Americans were not immune to, which ultimately killed 90% of the Indian population.
In 1533, John Calvin developed Calvinism through the doctrine of predestination. Calvinism was the belief that God had chosen a small number of men and women for salvation. The Protestant work ethic was introduced into the colonies and eventually led to today's middle-class values, the Protestant work ethic.
In 1584, the first attempt at a British colony was founded in present-day North Carolina and called Roanoke. Walter Raleigh got a charter from Queen Elizabeth I and in 1587 dispatched 150 immigrants to establish a colony.
When John White, the leader of the colony, returned in 1590 after leaving in late 1587, he and his men found the colony completely deserted, with no signs of people or war.
The only trace or clue left was the word Croatoan, carved into a tree at the edge of the colony. All the establishments were dismantled, not destroyed, so the colonists' departure was not a hurried one. Where and why the colonists left still remains a mystery to this day.
The Virginia Joint Stock Company received a royal charter and founded the first permanent British settlement in North America. They raised capital with the sale of shares and settled in the Chesapeake Bay. They named their settlement Jamestown after the King of England.
Chief Powhatan of the Chesapeake Bay Indians allowed the colonists to build a settlement in hopes of forging an alliance with them. He would give them food and supplies when the colonists needed. However, the colonists began to demand too much, and Powhatan became angry. The Pilgrims then had to resort to cannibalism and committed themselves to war against the Indians, determined for the success of their settlement.
Peace was reached in 1613 when one of Powhatan's daughters, Pocahontas, was captured. The chief was desperate for his daughter to remain safe, so a peace treaty was signed and celebrated by the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe, one of the leading colonists. Rolfe brought her back to England, where they were treated like royalty, but Pocahontas fell ill and died before she could return. During the conflict between the Jamestown colonists and Powhatan's tribe of Algonquian people, the Americans were constantly searching to find a merchantable commodity, such as tobacco, to sustain their economy. They knew this would be their key to surviving in America and keeping their colony from failing.
Tobacco became the center of the colonial American economy. In 1612, John Rolfe was the first grower of tobacco in America when he brought seeds over from an earlier voyage and sold his first harvest to the English. The tobacco boom in early America ultimately led to the increase in demand for slaves to work the plantations. Plantation owners were starving for a source of cheap labor, but as slavery increased, racial tensions grew.
Because there were so many men looking to capitalize on the tobacco industry, there was a lot of stress and competition between them. This stress sometimes led to more brutal treatment of slaves to ensure the perfect crop, only furthering the racial tensions.
Unfortunately, the massive concentrated tobacco production quickly exhausted the soil, causing fear among the Virginia Company that they soon might lose their profitability. In response, they began to award large plots of land to wealthy colonists who brought their own workers from England. This worked out perfectly because around the same time, the enclosure movement caused people to go looking for a new start and a new life in America.
During the enclosure movement in Europe, British landowning aristocrats wanted to rationalize their farms, so they began to use new farming technology. Crop rotation and grazing livestock forced poor farmers off the once communal land. The land became private and enclosed. Therefore, the poor moved to the cities in search of jobs. This increased homelessness and overcrowding in the cities.
Hello, I'm Howard Zinn. This increase of poor farmers started a new movement of servitude in the American colonies. Wealthy colonists in these colonies required labor for their farming of tobacco and cotton. The class of poor, homeless farmers capitalized on this and indentured servitude was created. These peasants, usually English or Irish, were looking for a new start and pled 2 to 7 years of unpaid labor for the safe passage to the Americas. This caused an economic dependence of labor on wealthy landowners. Look at your man. Now back to me. Now look at your man. Now back to me. Sadly, he is not me, but he could become me if he started using indentured servants rather than Native American slaves. Now look down. Now look back. I have that shovel you've been wanting badly. Now look down. Look back. I have oats. Quaker oats. See, anything can happen when you use indentured servants. I'm wearing shoes.
On the American tobacco farms, slave culture in the North differed from in the South. Because tobacco made up most of the northern economy and had more markets to ship out of, there were smaller plantations that generally treated slaves better. In the South, all economic activity was pushed through only a few markets that paid favor to bigger, more powerful plantations that worked slaves hard to get the perfect harvest.
Growing tobacco was not just a cash crop pursuit like the growth of rice or cotton. It required a lot of labor to yield the best quality, and with the high competition, there was also a high demand for quality within the plantations.
With massive population influx in America, the colonists found little need for Indian incorporation as marriage partners or workers, so they began to push them away. With this resistance came numerous Indian uprisings and more conflict in the colonies, which prevented the success of colonies and resulted in massive Indian death.
In 1624, the British king turned Virginia into a royal colony. The crown appointed royal governors to rule over the colony, while colonists also voted for representatives to each colony's local assembly, which had authority over taxes and finances. The House of Burgesses was the local legislature for the royal colony of Virginia, and the first institution ever of representative government in America.
The royal colonies eventually gained more power than was comfortable for the British crown, leading them to give the governor absolute power of the region. This created self-righteous, anger-filled assemblies, which created the theme for the American Revolution.
Proprietary colonies were introduced later between 1660 and 1690 and didn't have royally appointed governors. The land and governance of the land was given to the occupants, while the goods and tax money were sent back to England. These colonies set the standard for self-governance in the American colonies, but also led to resentment towards the crown for taking the profits from the hard-working American colonists.
Between 1625 and 1640, the colonial population doubled every 5 years until the total population was about 10,000 people. During this time, disease and violence led the Algonquian population to shrink.
The first official New England colony was founded in 1620 by a group of religious dissenters called the Separatists, but known today as Pilgrims. They thought the English church was so corrupt that they felt the only option was to move away and create new independent congregations. Backed by the Virginia Company and led by tradesman William Bradford, 102 pilgrims sailed from Plymouth, England, on the Mayflower and landed in Massachusetts Bay, where the colonists named the settlement Plymouth.
Once there, they established the Mayflower Compact, an agreement between the Pilgrims that set a precedent for later constitutions and the first document of self-governance in North America.
Hello, it's me, Howard Zinn again. Most of the Pilgrims died over the first winter due to disease and malnutrition, but were rescued by the Indians attempting to incorporate European colonists into their world. The Plymouth colony was always in debt to its investors and struggled to pay it back through trade, fishing, and hunting.
In 1629, a group of affluent Puritans, calling their company the Massachusetts Bay Company, got a royal charter to settle in the Massachusetts Bay. They used the abundant sea life to create capital and gain profit.
Roger Williams, a minister, came to New England in 1631 with his belief system that church and state should be completely separate and that religious tolerance was very important. He also preached keeping peace with the Indians and that the colonists had no right to take the Indian land without fair bargain.
These dangerous ideas got Roger Williams banished from the Salem colony in 1636. Bringing with him a few followers, William moved on to found the town of Providence. Another heretic of the time was Anne Hutchinson, who was banished from Boston after spreading the anti-Calvinist theory that anyone could work their way into heaven and that the Calvinist theories were growing too close to Catholicism. Hutchinson and her followers moved to Roger Williams' colony, and they got a royal charter from Charles I to create the Rhode Island colony.
In New England, the natives and colonists lived in very close contact. With the expansion of European settlement, the colonists encroached on Native American land, and the settlers were not able to keep peace with the Indians. These hostile relations led to many Indian colonist conflicts, such as King Philip's War.
Metacom, named King Philip by the English, was the leader of the Pokanokets. King Philip originally adopted the English ways and believed that his people would have a place in the American colonies. However, he realized the reality that his people would never have any place at all.
After many conflicts, the Plymouth leaders expanded into Pokanoket land, sparking anger in King Philip. The Pokanokets allied with many other Indian tribes to fight against the colonists.
These tribes moved all over New England, but eventually the colonists were victorious in one of the bloodiest Indian wars in American history. The Allied Indians formed an organization group of tribes called the Iroquois Confederacy, an organization which gained control of much of northern Indian territory.
Welcome to Survivor, America Edition. This season on Survivor, our contestants will have to combat the harsh American landscape, the vast Atlantic Ocean, and the brutal environment that is the Eastern American seaboard. Survivors ready? Go! This is sure to be a battle to the very end. Our contestants are strong and ambitious. This is going to be the most dramatic, exciting, and stupid Survivor you've ever seen yet.
At the same time, there was a great deal of conflict between the English powers and the colonists, mainly the indentured servants.
Bacon's Rebellion was a rebellion of indentured servitude against the English authorities in America, led by Nathaniel Bacon. In the Virginia colony in 1657, the indentured servants were being promised land after serving their terms, but due to the large native population occupying most of the land to the west, the angry servants were denied that land. The general rage directed towards the Indians led to both colonists attacking on Indian villages as well as the rebellion against the Virginia governor. The English government then favored armed expansion into Indian territory, leading to Indian unrest. Bacon's rebellion accelerated the transition from indentured servitude to slavery, as indentured servitude gained a more negative connotation. Farming also turned into a more wealthy business, especially for the large plantation owners and the top 1% of population in wealth. Meanwhile, in 1685, after the death of King Charles II, the king put in place during the Restoration, King James II was put into power. The English Parliament deposed King James II because they feared that he would attempt to establish a Catholic royal dynasty.
James II abolished the charter governments of the New England, New York, and New Jersey colonies, combining them into the Dominion of New England. But this angered the colonists, for they all had traditions of self-government. This caused uprising against the English.
This solidified the colonial goal of separation from England. In James II's place, Parliament put James's Protestant daughter and Dutch son-in-law, Mary and William of Orange. This began the Glorious Revolution. The new monarchs agreed to a Bill of Rights, promising to respect traditional civil liberties, to summon and consult with Parliament annually, and to enforce and administer parliamentary legislation. England became a constitutional monarchy.
Pre-revolutionary America, a time of destruction, violence, and oppression. Entire races fell, and ruthless white men made the New World a living hell. Despite the terrible actions of these selfish and cruel men, they built the base upon which this great nation of America thrived and hurtled towards the future. The heretical ideas of these fearless men and women drove them out of England, building a society based off of hard work and the drive for total freedom. This drive led early America towards its eventual separation from England, the American Revolution.
Blonde wig with pigtails, Jack.
You know, if I pace myself, I can do a whole box.
Turn, wink, go.
We even migrated inland. Is that weird?
That's the last year.
You ever get that feel
so
that you can't shift the tide that sticks around like summertime?
I have food. It's okay.
Hi, Zoe.
Laces up your sleeve. Have you no idea that you're
Good now.
in deep? I dreamt about you nearly every
Fridge is, like,
night
totally in
this
your face.
week. How many secrets can you keep? 'Cause there's this tune I
Are you though?
found that makes me think of you somehow when I play it on repeat. Until I fall asleep.
Life is so miserable.
Spilling drinks on my settee.
Trevor, still playing with the gun.
Sorta hoping that you'd stay. That the nights were mainly made for saying things that you can't say tomorrow day.